Hello, church. Thanks again for joining me on my study on the conscience of sin. Before we get back into Romans chapter 2, I just wanted to point out another truth concerning the conscience. God also used the conscience to make things real to us. So, an example of this, the more conscience you are of something, the more real it becomes. And that's why a guilty conscience, a conscience that is always reminded of its sins, bring forth the feeling of guilt. Because conscience of when you're conscious of something, is meant to press towards you, is meant to bring just the realness of it. And that's why some people have always said that the conscience is a judge. The reason they say that, and I don't quite agree with it, but the reason they say that is because the conscience bring forth a condemning feeling, almost like the judgment. The judgment has been manifested. But what God showed me through the Spirit is that whenever you're conscious of something, it becomes more real to you. And if you sin against the knowledge that the conscience reveals to you, if you go against it and do evil, then the conscience job is to make known to your mind that thing that you went against, its direction, and it stays there, and it stays there, and it stays there, and because it stays there, it becomes you're more aware of it, you're more conscious of it, and so it brings forth the feeling of guilt and condemnation. The Holy Ghost showed me that the reason God set it up that way is to get you to change your mind. Is to get you to change your heart. Get you to change your direction. The flip side, or a more positive note on the conscience, is that as believers, the more conscious we are of God's presence, guess what? God draws closer. God's presence becomes more real. And that's why it's important for us to talk to God, because the more you talk to God, the more you'll feel His presence, because the conscience is letting you know, in your new state, being a born again Christian, we have a new relationship with God. We're more conscious of God, and it's to our advantage to be conscious of the scriptures. It's to our advantage to be conscious of God's will, because guess what? God will make that will just clearer and clearer to you, because the conscience has a way of drawing out the knowledge of the thing that you're conscious about. So the positive note of the consciousness is that it can draw us more closer to the presence of God. But let us continue in Romans chapter 2. I think we left off in verse 13. So let's get started. For it is not the hearers of the law who are righteous before God, but the doers of the law shall be justified. Now here Paul is talking about for those who are under the law, you can't be justified by just hearing of the Ten Commandments. You just can't know that thou shalt not kill. You have to, and thou shalt not steal. You have to be doers. And God is not looking for you to kill anyone, but He's looking for you to not know that thou shalt not kill and then go and do it. So what God is looking for is those who are under the law. They must be keepers of the law that they know. Verse 14 tells us, For when Gentiles who have no law, now this is talking about the Mosaic law. This is talking about the law that God gave in stones to Israel. When the Gentiles who have no law do by nature the things contained in the law, these, though they have no law, are a law to themselves. Now, in my study, the word law is being used quite a few times in verse 14, in verse 15. In verse 14, the word law is used in a different format. In verse 14, let me read it again. It says, for when Gentiles who have no law, this word law right here is different from the law in verse 12. If you study the Greek, the word law in verse 12 has a different meaning than the word law in verse 14. So when we look at the word law in verse 14, this is the law of a person who is without the Mosaic law. So the Greek word for law in verse 14 is called animos. That's A-N-O-M-O-S. This is where we get the the English word anonymous. And the word anonymous means to keep an identity unknown. Well, that is not God's intention, to have man walk this earth and to keep his identity unknown. So when we come back, because I'm out of time again, we will get a little bit more deeper into the word law. And I pray that you would just be patient with me. And thank you again for tuning in. Join me again on our next study. Thanks. Bye.